Welcome to the October meeting of the Houston.net Users Group. You're welcome to join us in person for pizza, prizes, and networking on the second Thursday of every month. Our meetings are hosted by Improving Houston in their office at 10111 Richmond Avenue, just inside the Beltway in Houston's West Chase District. You can check us out for meeting notifications at hdnug.org, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn. Unfortunately, we didn't have a sponsor this month. But if you're interested in sponsoring HDNUG, please let us know in the comments below. And now our featured speaker, Claudio Lassala, presenting Testing in Agile, from afterthought to an integral part.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for showing up. It's Thursday. Usually by this time of the week, everybody's like already kind of tired. Are you? No? Full energy? All right. Because I'm going to be talking about the topic that I'm most passionate about, testing, and how that has affected the way I work with software. I was just at Houston Tech Fest a couple of weeks ago, and I had, 5 sessions? One of them was this very one. The other 4, they all somehow tied back to this content. That says, just to give you an idea of how important I think this topic is. Because we're not here to see, this is how you write assertions using a test library. No, it goes way beyond that. I'll tell you how I got started with testing, writing my assertions and all that stuff, but everything that I've learned ever since and why this is important. So thanks again for showing up. If you haven't seen me before, I'm Claudio Lassala. I work here at Improving as a principal consultant, which means I do software development on a daily basis. But I also go out as a consultant to work with different customers to help them improve their development, their practices, and their code base and things like that. I do a lot of training, agile training, programming, software development training in general. Yes?
You have Fox Pro on there. You do a lot of Fox Pro these
Fox
days?
Pro. I don't, but there's still a lot of people that, they come from a Fox Pro background, and they like seeing that because it's like, okay, I'm doing .NET or I'm doing Rails, and you know Fox Pro, so I can tell you things that we are doing in our apps, and I can ask you for advice on how we can actually move over to the newer stuff, the new 20-year-old .NET thing, right? That's why I put that up there. So I do all of that, but beyond all that boring thing, I also do play some music, and I ride my bike real fast. That's a lot of fun. And when I'm not doing any of those things, then I'm hanging out with my family. That's the kind of stuff that I do. So, testing. The way I've put together this thing here, by the way, we're going to be talking about, today, my view of testing in general and how that has changed the way that I do work. But we're going to be seeing the tip of the iceberg if you just have me on a conversation for 5 minutes about this stuff. But there's a lot that went on for me to get to where I am today. Because some people just started writing unit tests, and they say, well, that's easy. I mean, how much more can you find behind that? There's way more. And I'll tell you why I think that is. Back when I first started with testing, automated testing that is, it was always an afterthought. I would get with clients, get the requirements, implement the actual code, run the app, click buttons. Oh, it worked. Oh yeah, and then somebody said it's a good idea to actually go and write some automation, automated tests for the thing. So it was always an afterthought. Nowadays, to me, it's an integral part of the process. It starts way before actually sitting behind the computer to write code. For me, it starts at product backlog grooming with my POs, with my QA personnel, where we are actually walking through our user stories, through our acceptance criteria, way before writing the actual code. And why do we have to bother? Because writing code is actually expensive. Changing code is even more expensive. So we want to make sure that what got written actually resembles what the user story is, the reason, the business value behind the reason we've had to write the code to begin with, right? So that change in my head, and then practicing writing tests with that, I got much better as a software developer. Like in all cases, the way I write my code, the way I architect my solutions, the way I write my classes, I design my interfaces, it got a lot better because I've been following some of these practices. And even more important, it has taught me to interact with other people who are not developers, who are not actually just writing code, living and breathing C#, Java, and whatever else you want. Because at the end of the day, we have to interact with product owners, with business analysts. And if you're not doing that, well, you better start, right? And I always say that longer the days when people would pay you money and then give you some requirements, lock you in a room, right? Lock the door, slide pizza under the door, and come back, see you in 12 months asking for the results. We don't do that anymore as developers. If we are doing it, we should stop. We should actually be asking people, why are you creating this software? Is software the best solution actually for your problem? But if you're only interested on, okay, what is the programming language of choice? What is the JavaScript library of the week that we should be using? Forget all of that, right? That's not what's important about software development. So, in the beginning, when I first started with software development there back in the DBase days and Clipper and COBOL and FoxPro, Visual FoxPro, all that kind of stuff, how did I test software at the time? And a lot of people still do it the same way. We write the code, we compile, we run, and then we go click, 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 or at the time it was just down arrow, up arrow, Alt F, Alt S, Alt whatever, right? So you go clicking or tapping your way to get to the feature that you want to test. You put some input in there, and then you wait for it to either blow up or to show you the expected result. That's how we would test at the time. And that would involve, for instance, if you had like some sort of logging screen. Sometimes I mentioned, well, we had the splash screen. Remember splash screens? Nobody does that anymore, right? Where you run an app and then it shows a splash screen for like 5 seconds while it's loading stuff. And then it takes forever, and then it comes up with like a login screen. So when you were testing software, you would wait for all of that. Get to this screen, and it's like, well, what is the user and the password? And then you would key in the user and password, you would get it wrong, you would get frustrated, you would forget what you were trying to do to begin with. Eventually you would go through and get through the login screen, and then you would get some sort of menu right at the top, and you do file, this, that, and the other. Like 4 levels down, and then you hit the wrong place, the menu goes away, you have to go in and start clicking all over to get to the actual thing that you're trying to test. And then again, it takes so much time, it's like, what was I going to be testing again? You forget, right? And then by the time you get to the thing you're going to test, you don't do it in a proper way, because you're a human, you're going to forget about certain things, certain assumptions that you have, data, users, products, whatever you need in your system. You forget about those things. So eventually we figured a better way to do it. We started extracting code that sits behind buttons and key press events, and we started putting those into non-visual classes or non-visual files that we could just then go to a console, write a little app that would exercise the thing that we are trying to do. Right? So if it's like a calculator, you would instantiate the object, call a method passing parameters, print it to the console, and see the result. And then you would go either like, yay, it works, or oops, it doesn't, as a console write line type of thing. Right? We've done a lot of that. I know that I've done a lot of that. Right? You just write a little console app, you run it, and that's how you're testing your app. So I've done a lot of that in the past. And then back in 2004, I went to a conference in Canada where one of the topics that I saw on the schedule there was unit tests. I'm like, what the heck is a unit test? I have no idea what that thing is. So I went into that talk, and the guy was showing me how I could essentially, formalize those console apps that I was writing to test application. I could actually write it in a structured way so that a test runner would pick up things and run that for me, right? In the shape of, oh yeah, as long as you have a class that is decorated with a certain attribute and a method decorated with another type of attribute, that thing is gonna get called automatically by a test runner. So you can write your test that way. You can put it in your development process. You can have that run as an automated thing every night when the build runs, or as a continuous integration process. Awesome, right? And the way we've learned, and we are still learning, we're still teaching people about unit tests, we talk about the AAA standard, which I've been calling the training wheels of unit testing. Meaning, once you've learned your stuff, you don't do the AAA thing anymore. But I'll get back to it, why that's not something you move forward with. But anyways, the AAA, arrange, act, assert. All automated tests should follow this little template. The arrange part is where you put together your context. What is the scenario that you need your application, your module, your function, your class to have in order for you to test something? Oh, in order for that thing to work, you need to have a product in the system, and that product has to be in stock, and it has to have a price, and blah, blah, blah. All of those things will come in the arrange part. Once you've got that out of the way, you go to the act. You're gonna call whatever it is that's gonna trigger the behavior. It could be a method that you call, it could be an event that you raise, whatever. And then the assert part is, okay, once that thing is done, I should observe the following thing. The following thing could be a state-based test where you just look at data and see if the data actually maps to what you're looking for. Or it could be an interaction-based test, which means whenever there's that scenario and I call this behavior, the output of that should be a message sent to the following API. That's an interaction, right? Because what the API does, I have no idea. But so you just need to test your point of contact with the thing that you're calling. All good? Learn about those things. Yay, that's awesome. So I went on and wrote like hundreds of tests in that format. And that was great. At the time, it was way better than compile, run, click, 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 all that nonsense that we don't like doing. And then I heard about the thing of code coverage. I got bitten by the code coverage bug, right? Where I would run the little tools that will show me in green the lines of code that gotten executed, and in pink or whatever, red, the lines that didn't get executed, because we had this thing where, we need to have 100% code coverage. We need to make sure, that's how we thought. We need to make sure that every single line of code is executed. That means that our software is working and is of great quality. Ugh. And then we got into all this discussion. Yeah, no, 100%, way too much, because we shouldn't be testing property setters and stuff like that. And there are certain edge cases that we shouldn't really be testing. We don't care. Okay, so what's that very fine, good number that we should be achieving? 83%. And then people wrote extensions to make sure that, whenever you run your continuous integration build, your code coverage report should show, you have at least 83% code coverage. Right? What for exactly? Right? So I got to that point where I was doing a lot of that. I was searching for the holy grail of 100% code coverage. Unit tests quickly became integration tests. What I thought that, I was writing unit tests, I was really writing integration tests. How did I know that? Well, because I would have hundreds of tests that I wrote. I would push that into source control. A new developer would come in, would pull latest, would run the tests, and none of them would work. Like 100% failure. Like, well, but it works on my machine. Well, why don't they work? Because they're all relying on a database being there, on a connection string that's valid, on the security permissions being set properly. So
crazy registry keys.
Exactly, like some weird files, like, INI files on disk sitting on a very specific folder. So provided you had all those things, the automated test would work, which again was better than the alternative of not having any tests, but that was still not good enough. So I've learned about, okay, there are unit tests, there are integration tests. They both have a reason to exist, right? But that was not the case for what I was doing here. Also, I got into this thing where, oh, it's just test code. So you write the code, it's like I'm just throwing things together, that's my test, and I'm not gonna apply the same care to it, because here's the test code and here's the production code. This one you're gonna do pristine, test, it's just
I don't need to
code.
refactor my tests.
Don't worry, right? As long as you have 100% code coverage, hey, not really, right? And I've mentioned the training wheels there. One of the reasons, let me go back to the code coverage and say something that I've been seeing over and over and over again, where I go out as a consultant. The first thing usually I ask the company is, show me your tests. And sometimes I get, what tests? It's like, okay, we have a lot of work to do. Some will say, well, we have like a lot of tests, but we haven't been running them periodically. Well, why not? Well, because they take like 6 hours to run. Okay, so you have a lot of integration tests. Let me see it. Let me show you how you can turn those into unit tests, right? So that they're gonna execute way faster, they're gonna be a lot easier to maintain. And then I've seen situations where, looking at the whole AAA thing, where people would be instantiating stuff, setting properties, calling something, and then omitting this part. So tests without assertions. Why would they do that?
So they get 100% code coverage.
Right?
What'd you say?
So that they get 100% code coverage.
No failures.
No failures. If there's no assertion, unless something in there throws an exception, that guy's gonna say, we're good. I haven't seen smoke, coming out of it. That's how they would achieve 100%. If it compiles, ship it, right? And it's not something, oh yeah, that happened 20 years ago. No. Over and over. It's like, dude, where's the assert here? Oh yeah, no, that's just to satisfy some static analysis rule and blah, blah. It's like, if that's how people are using policies in static analysis, you're doing it all wrong, right? That's not the purpose of those things. But anyway, so I got all of that out of the way, and then my beef with a range act assert is that I started writing tests that resembled somewhat like this, way more complex. If I had put the actual ones, they wouldn't fit on a screen like this. But this is something that I got from working with a client recently, where I saw the test like this. Like, okay, it looks like the kinds of tests that I wrote 15 years ago, or 13 years ago to be more precise. Can anybody tell me why this kind of test sort of like offends me nowadays? What makes me not like tests written this way? It does what? Sorry.
Lots of arranging before even it gets to the part.
That's exactly it.
What is it?
It's correct.
That's exactly it. It's doing a lot of stuff. So let me tell you how I've learned to use tests. When I go into like a new project at a new company, clients or whatever, and there's already a code base, I ask them, okay, where are the tests? Let me look at the tests before you show me anything else, because the tests they should tell me a story. What are the important business features or components of this application? And by looking at the test, it should sort of like tell me what's important about it, what kind of dependencies I have on one thing over the other, and so on and so forth. When I get to a test like this, it does not tell me a story. But then people say, well, dude, if you're a C# developer, you should be able to read it. So, oh yes, as a C# developer, I can see that we have a test method, and we are declaring a variable using type inference here, and then I'm creating a mock for this interface here using this library, and then I'm mocking this method so that whenever it gets called with whichever parameters, I don't care about the values, I will always return true. I can also see that here it is creating another variable, type inference, creating now not a mock, a stub. See how fancy I am? I don't call everything a mock or a fake object. I know that this is a mock, this is a stub, right? As a C# developer who knows that stuff, I know about those things. Oh, great, so what? Right, because then it tells me here, well, I'm also mocking this guy, passing back this stub, and then look, it seems like I'm calling a method here, but then I see, oh no, I'm actually mocking all of those parameters, or disregarding all those parameters, and now is returning response, which is this stub that I've created at the top, right? So when I read this, in my head I hear like a little animal going like, mock, 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 mock. Because I only see like stuff being mocked. I see a lot of angle brackets. I see parameters being ignored. What for? So I can read perfectly what the code is doing. I have no idea why it's doing that. Just no idea. I know that in order to test the put action on this controller, I need all of that stuff. I just don't know why. No idea by reading the code. Just no idea whatsoever. And then I get to the assert. Okay, once that guy executes, it should be of type object result. And that thing, the value should not be null. And the value should be assignable to that type. Right? I'm like, this test probably gives me the 100% code coverage on that method. Yay, right? I have some sort of automated testing there, but that's not what we should be using tests for. Okay? And I'll get to how I actually prefer rewriting that code. But anyways, many years ago, that's how I would write tests, and I wrote thousands and thousands of tests like that. Later, I got introduced to this, the STAR-DD things. Test-driven development, behavior-driven development, domain-driven design, right? Started reading about these things. A lot of like the cool kids, the hippie kids were talking about those things. I'm like, okay, that seems like important. And some like real smart guys were talking about those things. I'm like, okay, let me try it also and see how much of that I can actually absorb. Those things, putting them all together and evolving the way I was seeing tests, it really changed the way I think completely. But it was not something that happened overnight. It took me years and years to actually get to the realization of what I'm sharing here today. So for instance, at one point, when we get started writing unit tests, or what we think there are unit tests, we name the methods, the test methods, something like test 1, test 2, test 3, test 4. We don't spend much time thinking about a good name for those test methods because it's just test code. Who cares? Eventually I realized, well, when those test methods fail, the output will say test 1 has failed. What is test 1? I have no idea. There's 1,034 tests on this solution. I don't know what test 1 is. So I started renaming my methods to something that's a little more, specific to what I'm testing. In this regard, the word class here. I didn't mean to say class, it should be void for a test method. But I started naming things like withdrawing money should decrease balance by amount. Okay. If there's a problem in the code and the test fails, I can read in the output something that will say withdrawing money should decrease by balance by amount, failed. Oh, okay, I know the feature, the business thing, the English-friendly description of what actually failed, okay? Now, a lot of people didn't like that because it's like, man, those are long names for C# methods. Who cares, right? So what? We happen to be using C# to describe tests. We don't need to follow exactly the same name conventions that we use in regular C# production code, let's say. So that was already fine for me, but I wanted to take that a step further, and I started, let's use some, word boundaries there, right? Started putting underscores so that I can clearly see the word limitation. So does that look like somewhat like German, right? Where you just put all the words together to compose one word, and that's really complex. As I started studying some German this year. So I started doing it like this. Of course, those underscores drove a lot of C# developers nuts. And I was just like, dude, deal with it, right? Oh, but if you're gonna call that IntelliSense is gonna show, that's like, you shouldn't be calling those methods manually anyways. Those methods are meant to be called by a test runner during runtime. You shouldn't touch those methods on your own, right? So get over that. And then looking at that, I was like, why am I making every first letter capital? It looks like the title of an article. That's not the purpose of the name of the method. So I started doing it like this. Make it all lowercase. It's a sentence, right? It happens to have those underscores just because of C#, but it reads like a sentence. And then I started using casing to draw people's attention to what's important, right? Because if I'm looking at tests, I'm trying to learn what the business feature is, I glance over this, I see withdrawing, decrease. Usually those things go together. If it was instead withdrawing, increase, my head would say, dude, stop, slow down, and read it. Because maybe it was, in a transfer situation, withdrawing from the source account should increase the balance in the target account. Oh, okay, got it. Right? Draw people's attention to what's really important. Big lesson there. Then the next step is user stories, right? Because if I started writing my test methods in ways that take me back to user stories, acceptance criteria, I started looking at user stories in a whole different way. As we start learning user stories, that's the template that normally a lot of people go with, right? As a something, I want to blah, 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 so that something, right? That's your typical template. Now, how do you guys like a user story like that? Is that a good one? As the system, I want to remove duplicate entries from my address database tables so that I don't have duplicates.
System is not a customer.
System is not a customer. Sure. That's a bad thing, yeah. What's the purpose of a user story?
Should meet the invest criteria. So independent, negotiable, valuable, customer,
Right?
estimatable, small.
What's the, what did he say?
Invest, which is an acronym for good user stories. So the bottom line is a user story should have value, should add value to the business, right? So if a client comes and tell me, Claudio, I need you, I'm gonna pay you money to implement this user story. I will say, no, I will not do that. Oh, how come? Because from the knowledge that I currently have, I cannot see any conceivable way that you're going to be making money out of this. It just does not make sense. If it does to you, please explain. I need to learn. But removing duplicate entries from a database table, how does that give you, an advantage over your competition? It doesn't give me that. Now, what if I had that user story written like this? As a marketing manager, I want to send direct mail with no duplicate addresses so that I save on mailing costs of marketing initiatives. Now we're on to something, right? Now I can see where you can either make money or save money if I give you a certain solution. That's cool. Now, what is the most important part of this user story?
Who it's for.
Sorry?
I would say in the story level, we put who it's for first. In the feature level, we put why first. So if you're doing a whole feature, why is most important because it's going to stop you from doing it.
Thank you very
Once
much.
you get to the story level,
Yep.
well, now you already know that it was important, but you still need to state it so you have the context. But who it's for is going to give you the context of what you're making.
Yes. So the most important part of this user story, or this template of user story, is always the so that part. That's the last line is the most important thing out of that user story. Why do we make it be the last one if it's the most important? Right? So I started, because I've seen people either spending a lot of time thinking what is the type of user or what is the action, and then by the time they get to the last line, they've been like already fighting for so long on the discussion on those two lines, they end up missing the point of why are we doing this anyways, right? Or sometimes they just put like some very generic, like as the user, anything that touches that application is a user. Even like an API that's calling another API. API A is a user of API B. So if I see a user story that says as the user, I'll just say just stop right there because we have work to do here, right? Right? So I go with the notion that the guys, the Cucumber website, they started promoting several years ago, which is to flip that around and turn that so that into a in order to sentence. In order to, this is your business value. Then you tell us about the rest of the stuff. It's not that these two are not important. They're just not as important as the first one, right? Because when somebody starts the conversation with something like this, they're talking technical. You're talking tables in databases. What if you don't have a relational database? Maybe you have a document database, or maybe you're just storing things on an XML file on disk. It doesn't matter. It's very technical, right? We don't want to do that. On the other hand, if the person starts the story with this, we can then ask why, right? So you're trying to save on mailing costs of marketing initiatives. If you start with that, somebody who's involved in the business may say, you know what? You don't need software for that. Because when we send these letters above a certain number, the post office will give us a discount it's gonna make all sense. We don't have to pay, big bucks to implement that, right? So the bottom line is, if you get to answering that in order to part, you can take a step back and think, is it software what I need? Because the business comes first and foremost, right? We shouldn't be getting hired as software developers to write code. We should be paid to actually provide the best solution for people. And sometimes that best solution is not software. And remember, back in the day, we used to be called programmers. So clearly, we were paid to write code. Nowadays, we are called developers. That does not mean that you are going to be writing code. You're going to be helping somebody develop sometimes a solution for their business that may not involve software. And then the other day when I mentioned this to some people, they're like, well, you wouldn't take the guy's money if he's asking. It's like, no, I wouldn't. Because he's trusting me to give him the best solution. So my work ethic says, dude, as much as I appreciate you wanting to give me money to do that, that's not what you actually need. It may be what you want, but let me show you what you actually need.
mean, is this, I guess I want to say, in the day, this guy was called the analyst. I mean, you're doing the analyst job now, or merging, developer is a
Yes.
programmer analyst.
Yes, it took me a lot of time to come to that realization, because coming from a DBase, Clipper, Foxborough background, whenever I would get with clients, they would say something like, oh yeah, here we have our clients, they purchase our products, and they may purchase several products. I would start thinking in my head, clients table, product table, orders table, many to many, one to many. I was seeing the world in a tabular format. I would see everything in the shape of columns and rows, right? That's how I've learned. I've learned to write software, to build software from the database up. It took me forever to start flipping that around and just asking, why am I doing this? Am I writing code just for the sake of writing code because it's a lot of fun writing code in my language of choice? Because if that's the case, dude, that's gonna wear out. You have to see, through that. Once I started taking this step back to actually understand, look, why? In order to, why? Why are you willing to pay me money to write you code? Tell me exactly how you're gonna be either making money out of this or how you're gonna be saving money by having that. Then I'll figure out the best way to accomplish that. All this realization came from writing my little unit tests, right? And I'll tell you more as we move along. Questions, comments? Otherwise, I just keep talking.
What if it's a technical thing that you want to accomplish? In that case, you don't really have,
What kind of technical thing? Give me like an example there.
like, I want to create a payment system to do something. It's like a technical work in the background.
Payment system?
Or let's say I want to create a different domain or something like that, where I'm not exactly, it wouldn't affect the business, they would know cost on back end, but make it more efficient, let's say.
There is your business value there. You're trying to make something more efficient. Why?
Scale.
Just for the sake of it? To scale. To scale why?
To have more employees, so you can make more money.
Right? So at the end of the day, I mean, you may have stories that they may somewhat look technical, but there is a purpose behind it. You're not just doing that because it's like, oh, it's fun doing all this, scaling things, There's more to it. There's usually a business case for it. Now, there are moments where you're gonna be, maybe you're writing like a text parser, right? Which is a very technical thing. In order to implement the big picture, you're gonna have to write like a little text parser. I will still write my tests in a way that will resemble this format. In order to, why am I writing that text parser? So I'm gonna answer that. That's what has value for me to provide the bigger value for the client. So I'll still think like that. Why am I writing a text parser exactly? Maybe there's one in the market already, or maybe not. So then if instead of thinking of the world in the shape of columns and rows, if I start seeing the world in these terms, then I'm not bound to technology anymore. And my conversation with other people, regardless of their background, will actually flow. Because if I can talk to people in these terms, I can talk to other developers, I can talk to testers, I can talk to business analysts, to product owners, because we are all speaking the same language. It's English in the most basic form to actually understand why are we doing what we are doing. Make sense?
Don't you get pushback from product owners who don't want to spend any more time on the story than they need to, and they can just write something really quick?
Oh, yeah.
And not have to think about it?
All the time. It's like, yeah, and then you keep asking me why these things are taking so long, why we are sizing the stories as big as we are. It's like, you're not giving us enough information. So yes, A lot. I've heard that not so long ago, where people said, "Wow, why would I spend like 30 minutes trying to finish this sentence in order to just get the thing done?" And I say, "Well, I'll get it done with how much, however much you gave me. In 2 weeks from now, or by the end of the sprint, I will give you something, and you're gonna tell me it's not what you want." And then I will say, "Well, so let's iterate over it, and let's reprioritize for next sprint, and then we give it another shot." And then another one, and then another one. And then you do the math at the end of the release plan to see how much we spend on that one thing that you could have spent half hour just giving me an answer to that sentence.
Studies show if you get the requirements wrong, you can end up paying 100 times more.
Exactly.
It's true.
And the longer it takes you to figure it out, the
Yeah.
more it costs you.
Yeah, because, and that's the point that I tell people. It's like, dude, if you're having a hard time finishing one sentence in English, guess how hard it's going to be for me as a software engineer to come up with everything needed to implement the thing that we don't even know what we need it for. It's going to be a lot harder, right? Writing JavaScript, C#, XML, CSS, HTML, it's a lot harder than finish a sentence in English. Come on. And then people start, yeah, maybe this dude has a point, right? But it takes time. Getting people to, think that way. Because you have to work on both bases, right? You have to work with the POs so that they start thinking about the user stories in these terms. And you have to work with the developers for them to also understand why the user stories have that kind of format, right? Because then the next step after the user story, acceptance criteria. It's what's sitting at the back of your index card if you're doing Scrum and user stories like that. Acceptance criteria is your famous given, when, then. It's how you describe the scenarios under which the user story is going to be validated by the business, right? So, like one case for that user story. Given the current user is a marketing manager and duplicate addresses exist, when sending direct mail, then only unique addresses get mail. This is very clear. What am I giving? So what's the scenario? What is the context that we are testing this? When sending direct mail, that's what's happening. It's when we send direct mail, that's when that thing actually makes sense. For anything else, like, well, so we should remove all of the duplicate entries? Not necessarily. Maybe we have duplicate entries for like performance optimization on queries in other parts of the system. We don't know, right? Here it's very specific. Here is when that actually makes sense. And this is the behavior that I'm expecting out of that feature, right? Makes you think, because if you only say, given a current user, so it's like any user, because you're saying, well, marketing managers would get that behavior. But what if somebody says, oh, yeah, marketing manager, but if the director says, I do not care, I want to send duplicate addresses because that way I'm going to send more business to the post office and then we're going to get some payback or whatever. Well, now what do we do? So it forces you to think about that. Do different types of users, roles in the organization, will that story vary based on that? Makes you wonder, right? Makes you ask the questions and then implements the best thing. This is how I write my tests. Every single unit test that I write nowadays, I start with that format. Given, when, then. Which maps to AAA. Arrange, act, assert. Arrange, act, assert. So it's the same thing, dude. Why are you telling me to change? Well, assert is very specific for developers, right? For POs, arrange, act, assert, why are you telling me? Arrange, why? Well, because I have to arrange the objects and the data. That's too technical. Given, that's our natural language. Given that I have this, given that I have that, when this thing happens, then I should observe this. It's way more fluent, right? It's way more business-like. So even when I'm testing like technical things that I'm implementing, I still use the same given, when, then, given, when, then, right? So that I wouldn't end up with a test that doesn't have an assert, for instance. Because my template calls for given, when, then. If I don't have a then, it's like, why am I calling that behavior to begin with? Okay?
What would you,
Yeah.
in a case where this is ideal for the marketing guy, people getting multiple mails pisses somebody off, and messes with his user experience, and his boss or somebody way up there goes, oh no, we find we have savings by sending duplicates. In this case, what does a resolution look like?
What is the resolution
I mean,
between?
you've got two entities with different agendas, and, you know, both are logical. So in real life, how does that usually play out?
That would be a role-based solution.
You
So-
get them in the same room, or?
Right? Then it gets to the whole political things, and you know who's actually the person who has the final say on things.
Yeah.
As developers, right, if you're a software developer, you have to raise those questions. A product owner is the person representing the team with the stakeholders. So the product owner would have to sit with the business and say, look, the following branches or cases have been identified. As the business, you guys tell us what is of value, right? Do we account, or do we handle the case for this type of role or for this other? Then it's a business decision, and usually the POs will help, you know, this coordination with the stakeholders.
Product owners determine what we do and when we do it.
Exactly, right? Because the PO, they are like the captain of the ship, right? As developers, we follow their lead, right? But we have to help them by backing up okay, are we missing the point of the business value of these things?
We have to give them the input that's needed in order to make a decision that's representative.
Correct. Yep. Excellent. So with that in mind, going back to that sample of a test that I've run into several months ago, right, where we had the arrange and all of this stuff, and then the act and all this stuff, and assert, I changed that to this. A lot more pleasing to the eyes. And it says, given user exists in data store, given successful service response, when calling post with the S key, which is something that their business understands, and a substitute for model, then result should indicate okay response with the actual model. Right? With something like this, anybody can read it. Not just the developers, but also the testers, also the POs. Whoever needs to read it, even though it's in C# and it has some underscores and stuff, I mean, a lot easier than reading this. Even as a developer, even though I can read all of that, I don't know really what's going on there. It turns out that all of that stuff up here, right, from here to here, that translates into given user existing data store. That's what all that nonsense means, right? It's like, how would I infer that from this? Well, so there is a service that has a configure method that's gonna get called. When that gets called, return a true, and then eventually this method gets called, you return this stuff that you've set up here. How would I infer these two sentences from that code? What I did was, as I started refactoring the code, right, I refactored it. In the first iteration, it was something like, given a mocked configure method on the portfolio service. I literally extracted those two lines in a method that read pretty much what I just said. Because that's the only thing I could say from this, right? And I did that for every single bit that was like, I don't know what that's doing. So given the update portfolio returns the following response. That's all I could figure out of it. So I got to that point where I had a much cleaner test, and then I went after other developers on the team and say, okay, come on over, explain to me why is it that we need to mock this thing to always return a true. Then I've learned that, well, we need to do that in order to indicate to the system that the user exists in the data store. Okay, why didn't the code tell me that? Right? So as I went through that code base, I started doing this kind of stuff. Because asking some developers, not everybody actually understood that that's what was going on. Inside of the same team, not everybody could actually tell you that. Once we changed it to this, it's like, oh, why are we doing that to begin with? How does that make sense? It starts, raising these questions.
But aren't you basically shifting those modes into different methods?
They are just methods at the bottom of the class,
And those modes are.
right? So it's the whole idea of, I write the code like this, it resembles something that people who know English can read and can follow, regardless as to whether they're programmers or not. And I just push them to the bottom of the file. Because as I get into a project and I'm learning about the code base, I look at this as like, okay, there's this data store thing, and I'm assuming that we have a successful service response, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. That's enough for now. Or maybe no, now I'm working on fixing a bug on that area. Oh, okay, F12, oh, I see, that's what's going on there.
By having the appropriate name, you're gonna know what the intention was, because sometimes you might be stepping through a method and you're like, well, I see what it does, but I don't know what they wanted to do. Here, you know what they want to do, so you just fix it.
Yep. And to make matters worse on that case, like this was a file where it didn't have just a single test like this. It had like 20, 23 test methods that they all pretty much looked like this.
So that whole arrange was repeated time.
Copy, paste, copy, paste. So what did I have?
So nobody refactored their unit tests.
Exactly, because they're just test code.
See, but one of the attributes of a good developer is what? Laziness, right? That disrupts my inner lazy. If I have to write all of that arrange code in every unit test, and this is what I said, that disrupts my inner lazy. That's too much, that's more work than I want to do.
Yeah, but a lot of people is like, well, the lazy in me just says copy and paste. That's how you're going to get this thing done.
But what happens if we change how we handle identifying if there's a user in the system? Now I have to change how many different unit tests?
Yeah.
Because we would use
Yeah.
the same argument, right?
Yeah.
In our actual code, right?
Yeah. So that's the thing, like I'm reading this one file with like 300 lines of code, and I'm trying to see, because one complaint was that, oh, we have all these unit tests, but it's getting really harder and harder to maintain them. And it's like, okay, I can clearly see now why.
Because they write crap tests.
Right? Because then in some cases it was like everything looked exactly the same except that like one parameter was different, like one little thing. But your head, your mind is seeing so much of things that look alike that
You don't
have
see
to,
it.
you don't see it. And sometimes it's like an exclamation mark to do the negation. It's like you lose it because your mind gets tired of looking at so many characters that look alike, those sequences of characters. So as I started identifying that, people started realizing that instead of, copying and pasting that into new methods, once you have something like this, and you start like, if I had to create like a new test in there, I could reuse the givens that I have there. So I could say, given user exists, oh, there's already a method that does that. I don't need to do all of that mocking stuff because I already have a method that does all that. Right? And then you start organizing your classes in ways that these things are context. So you start doing context-based testing, where your classes, your test classes, will be created based on the context, not based on the actual test class that you're testing. So we don't do that, I was going to say, that standard of doing one test class per class. Don't do that. test a feature, or go beyond that, test the context of a feature, a scenario of a feature. Because then you have one test class where you set up the scenario for that one aspect of that story. And then you test everything you can out of it. For another scenario, don't use the same file. Even more so if the scenario is very different, the context is very different. It's like, well, for this other scenario here, I need not only a product, but the product has to be missing in stock, which is going to trigger this other thing, and you're testing the same feature. But the context is completely different. Put that into a separate file, right? So organize things based on the feature, on the scenario, not on the class that's implementing that behavior. Because when you start implementing a behavior, you may start with one class. And then as you start making up your mind about the design of that implementation, you're going to start splitting those into smaller classes, right? So think about the feature, not each class, because that could change. It takes time to get into that mindset, but going with this kind of thing, you start getting the benefit out of it. Because now what happens is, I started doing this in C# several years ago, like 9 years ago or something like that. When I transitioned over to Ruby on Rails for a number of years, this is how I would write my tests. Even though I was writing in Ruby, the structure of the tests were the same. So no big thing about like getting my mind into different ways of doing things. No, it's still the same thing. As I went back to .NET, I continued doing this. As I work with other developers, I teach them the advantages of doing things this way. Whether you're testing stuff on the back end, on the front end, you're writing JavaScript tests for React, for Angular. Think this way. What are you given? What's happening? What's the result? Get everybody thinking along the same lines. Okay? Big realization there. Let's see how we're doing on time. All right. So the transition from AAA, arrange, act, assert, to GWT, given, when, then. Starting this campaign, no given, when, then, no code. As a developer, if you don't have your given, when, then, you shouldn't be writing code. You don't know what you're writing. You don't know what you're implementing. Oh, there is this thing that we may be doing, and maybe there's no. Well, one day we may need stop. Given, when, then. If you don't have given, when, then, chances are you don't have enough requirements. Your user story, the acceptance criteria is not there. In Agile, Scrum, conversation, you pick up a user story and you don't have enough, you go talk. You talk to the tester, you go to the tester and say, dude, for this user story here, how are you going to be testing this? The guy may tell you, oh, I need to create this, I need to populate this data, I need to click this button. Oh, that's your given. You're going to extract your given from that. But sometimes the tester will say, oh, I don't know. So let's pair up and go talk to the business analyst or to the product owner. Somebody needs those answers so that we are all on the same page. So that by the end of the sprint, we actually know what we are delivering. Right? But you need to know those beforehand. Or maybe you just don't understand the requirements, and that's fine. Maybe you do have your given, when, then there, but it's like, I'm not sure I understand. So go talk to people. Make sure you actually know, because that's way easier and cheaper than writing code for something you don't know what you're implementing, and then fixing that code later. Because if you're writing the code poorly also, changing code is more expensive than writing code initially. Right?
Also, one of the advantages of given, one, then, everybody has heard of SpecFlow.
Yes.
SpecFlow, basically you would create your test and also have different values.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
testing, you don't have to write that test just because the values is being stored.
I've learned a lot of this from Cucumber, which uses Gherkin, which is where SpecFlow comes in. It's exactly the same thing, except that SpecFlow is more like even like from the outside in. which I like, but it's not like the test that you're gonna be writing for everything. But my point is, if you're writing stuff from the outside in, which I recommend, you know, whether you're in spec flow or all the way down here in your unit tests, use given when then. All across, you know, across all the layers, right? Given when then. What are you given? What's happening? What result do you expect? Simple things like when I walk into a code base and I see assertions written like this, it makes me like barf a little bit, right? Because all I see here is a wall of characters, right, that repeat, and something that looks different at the end. But then again, it forces me to read through the whole thing, because maybe there's an exclamation mark someplace negating the whole sentence. So it makes me read through everything. Instead of doing this kind of construction in your tests, I would like something like this. Meat lover pizza should have toppings in the list of toppings. Way better, right? Because if I have code like this, anybody can read. It makes sense in the business domain, right? Because pizza has toppings, as opposed to, oh yeah, assert is true, pizza, toppings, any topping, the funny thing. It's too technical. Don't do that. Do this.
But aren't you putting your test method inside the object itself? Like these numbers?
I'm creating an extension method in an extension methods library that only exists in my test method, in my test project,
Oh, okay.
right? So based on the domain, again, domain-driven design, ubiquitous language, right? So these things, as I hear people talk, oh, we have pizzas, we have toppings. That's a language specific to that domain. So I put that in my test project as extension methods, and it's there. I can reuse that in my tests.
Oh, okay.
Exactly, right? And then the whole, okay, how do I verify if the pizza has those toppings? At that point, I don't care if it's a collection, an array, how that thing is represented inside of an object. I'm just saying, look, pizzas should have those toppings. How internally it's actually implemented, abstract that away. We talk about abstraction in object-oriented programming and all that, and we totally forget about it when we're writing tests. It's like, dude, it's just code. Apply the same clean code aspects to it as you do with your regular code.
What if you have a pizza making machine and your list of toppings is more than one element is in the list of toppings? There's more than one. Is that kind of
It should.
for that?
Well, it depends, right? So if you say like pepperoni, pepperoni, and the other stuff, it depends on the business. What should the business say? It's like, does
Well, if it's listed more than once, that means you get multiple units of that particular
it's
topping.
extra, right? If you apply extra. But that's a business thing, right? It's like, what should happen if I actually have like cheese listed twice? Maybe the business says, well, if it's listed twice, that's how we handle extra cheese. I don't know. It could be whatever. I don't know, but it's not a
It could be
decision
valid,
for
it could
the-
be invalid, who knows? And if it's valid, then let's have a test that
Yeah.
validates that it's handled correctly, and if it's
Exactly.
invalid, let's
Yeah.
have a test
Yeah.
that validates that it's handled correctly.
in the assumptions, right? As you describe the scenario, you say, okay, in this scenario, if people see like pepperoni listed twice, this is the reason. The test will tell you, this is why we allow that situation. Or if it's not, then you explain you shouldn't have double toppings of any kind in the thing. And then this method here should tell you, look, this test failed for the following reason. I found this topping twice. It shouldn't happen, right? But then those assertion messages, you hide it behind here. And then you compose your messages as opposed to just saying, oh, we expected a true and we got back a false. What does that mean? Right? If you put those behind extension methods, then you can prepare your message with something more meaningful. Right? Is there going to be a question? Here? Okay. Cool. Almost there. No time here, almost there. So huge realization for me, those things, putting those pieces all together. Started writing way better tests, way better than I was in the past. My code became way better as well. Now, I've gone from the, oh, that's just test code, to I want my code to look as clean, if not even cleaner, than the actual implementation code. Okay? So I want my test to be pristine. I want people to be able to learn about a feature, a user story, whatever it is, a component, by going to the test and reading the test. The test is the living and breathing documentation of the code. As long as the test is clean, pristine, I can change the implementation as much as I want because I have the test to back me up. Right? So I put a lot of effort, a lot of care into making sure that the tests look really good. Because also that opens up possibilities to work with other people that are not just essentially developers. So nowadays, for me, my utopia in a Scrum project is to, as we pull stories or put stories onto the board, I want to work with not just other developers, but also with testers or product owners. If I pick a story that I don't understand, I'll go and ask the PO. If I pick a story that I don't know how we are going to be testing that, I'm going to work with the tester. Because remember, in Scrum, there are no programmers and testers. There are developers. Both the people writing the implementation code and the people testing, we are both called developers. Because in the end, if we're doing this right, we are doing both things. As a developer, I write implementation code and I write tests. I am testing the stuff that I'm building. A tester will also be testing the app and writing automated tests, Selenium tests, whatever. Maybe I can work with my tester to write my given when thens. So in some teams, I taught them to actually, instead of having the developers, the programmers to write the given when thens, I actually got QA testers to write the tests for me, the placeholders, the given when thens. They would check in that part, pick the story from the Scrum board. The guy's gonna say given when then, following this structure. They would push that code into source control. As the guy coding that, I would pull and implement the actual behavior. So then you get your testers involved, engaged from day one into the sprint. Because how many times have I been to Scrum projects where people say, well, developers spend 2 weeks writing the code, and then on the very last day of the sprint, they turn the code in and tell the testers to start testing. Like, why are they only getting exposed to that on the very last day of the sprint? Get them involved in day one. Get them thinking, what are the test cases? How are we going to be testing that? Collaborate, because as I write my unit tests, my BDD tests, we're already talking. The guy will know, once I say I'm done, you'll know exactly what he needs to do to set up the system, to go through, click through, from day one into the sprint. Huge thing. Am I able to do that with every team? Heck no. I wish, right? But again, it's an ongoing process. You get developers, programmers into this habit. You work with your QA. A lot of QA people, they are thrilled when I get them to actually write C# code like that, right? They're like, oh man, I'm writing code, that's awesome. I didn't know I could do that. Yeah, you can. You get people more engaged, more, happier with their work. And that collaboration, it's only beneficial. Think English first. Forget about, do I need to do a null check on that? Am I gonna do an if block or a switch statement? Think English, right? Don't think like as you write your code, don't do like if object exclamation mark equals null, double ampersand, and then a bunch of stuff and pipe or this, that, or the other. Instead of writing your code that way, do something more like if product dot not available, do this other thing here. Think English first. Right? So as you're writing conditionals in your code, think about in English terms, what is the question that you're trying to ask? Make that a method somewhere, either on the class itself or on the object that you're calling. That thing is responsible to tell you the actual implementation. Think English first. If you think English first, you get other people doing code review for you that are not necessarily developers. I've gotten into this thing where I can actually get POs and QA people to review my code, right? Because they can actually follow the structure of the code, even though it's C#, it's whatever, they can actually read, because I'm not like throwing lambda expressions and angle brackets from generic types at them. I'm actually writing code that you can read. There are weird dots and parentheses because you cannot do away with those, but still you see English words there. Way better. People sympathize with that. So that's what I had. Now I guess we have a couple more minutes, like 5 minutes for questions and whatever else I didn't
And how
tackle.
do you set up a task for the automatic data binding between all the control uniform and the model?
Sorry, say
Okay,
that.
how do you set up a testing for the automatic data binding between the controls and the model?
The controls
Yeah,
and the
control
model.
uniform And the model.
Okay,
The model.
and you're talking about what kind of
Like
applications?
example, we don't do field programming, we do all the binding, right?
WPF and all that
Right.
stuff.
Automatic
So when I
binding.
was doing, it's been like 7 years since I've done any WPF. When I used to do test-driven development,
Yeah.
where I would start with the test and I would do everything based on my view model. So my view model would have my data and my behavior,
Right.
right? My commands and stuff like that. And I would test everything around those view models, because the data binding is that thing, it's late bound in WPF.
Right, but
Right?
it control the value, right? It control the value that the user select from each control. One control can affect the other control.
Correct. So if you put that on the view model, that interaction you can test in code. The visual aspect of it, very hard. So anything that's not visual, I push into the object so that I can test them. Because when the people doing the test, the manual test, if they say, well, I'm putting this value here and it's not updating this other thing here, if I have unit tests for the behavior, then I know it has to be something related to the data binding. Maybe the expressions that we have on the data bindings there, there's a typo or something. So I go straight to the binding.
Okay.
Way easier to fix the problem than if I have like a lot of code in the WPF, the XAML stuff. It's like, well, then I don't know where it is. Writing automated tests for UI stuff like that, that's disgusting.
Right, okay.
Right.
But the model may not have any code.
The model may not have any code.
Right, so how do we do testing for that?
Well,
We have to
but
do
the
like-
model exists because it gets populated by something.
The model will like contain the properties. For
The model
value
contains
type, back and
properties,
forth, yeah.
right? And then there's something that's gonna populate those properties,
Right. Like
right? So you
control.
have to write code against the thing that creates this model for you. So as long as you have tests around this, you're like 95% there. The remaining part is you just have to make sure that when you do your data binding, you're binding to the right property.
Right, but if we don't, then how do you test that? Make sure that we bind it to the right, we use the correct field name.
There are ways to do that, but honestly, I don't go that far with that kind of stuff, because that's typically the thing that, even when you have automated tests, you still need people actually clicking through it to make sure that things are working well. And if there's a data binding issue like that, they will say, dude, it's not showing the value here. I can see it. If your automated tests can see it, I can see it.
But it's hard to troubleshoot, right? You have to go back.
There are actually, if I remember correctly, Visual Studio, when you build a WPF project, or no, not when you build, when you run it. In runtime, it's going to spit out if there are binding issues. It shows on the console output if there are data binding issues. So you could somehow, tap into that. It would be an option, but if you create views that are small enough, finding that kind of stuff shouldn't be a big deal. Now, if you create screens that have like 300 controls on it, then you're out of luck, right? You just shouldn't be doing that. We don't create screens anymore that have like tab controls within tab controls with 200 controls on it. Don't do it. Create small views, very specific to the one task that the user is doing. Because then if you have like 3-4 fields on the screen, it's very easy to catch data binding issues, right? And again, data binding issues, that's like the lesser of your problems, right? Because usually it's like the behavior that goes behind populating those objects that where we usually mess up. It's an API that we're not calling in the right way, the data that we're passing in that's incorrect, the way that we're retrieving the data from the UI and then passing it down.
No, but if you use observable, the database send the data directly to the control. If you use observable, right?
If you do
If
what?
you use observable on the control on the property, the data sent back and forth directly, mapping to the control.
Right, yeah, if you're doing, a view model with the identify property changed and all that stuff, right, it's all there, and then you test your object. It's a non-visual object. Yeah, no, non-visual object, you can test.
I'm talking about the visual object.
Yeah, the visual objects is like, well, you're checking whether certain pixels are rendered on the screen, and it gets, so then, just to wrap it up, because people say, okay, so should I write tests for everything? How many unit tests should I have? How many integration tests should I have? What's the ratio? Usually my thing is, anything that's non-visual should be 100% tested. There's no reason not to test non-visual stuff. They should be easy. Oh, some of my objects are not because they call APIs and they do a million things. Well, the objects shouldn't be doing a million things to begin with, right? So you should split them into smaller objects that are easy to test, period. If there are visual aspects of your application that are really important, then my question to customers usually is, okay, show me the features, the visual stuff that if it doesn't work, you're gonna be losing money. Show me that, because then I'm gonna look into UI automation to test only those things. Because UI automation, very expensive, hard to write, and it takes forever to run. So you don't have to test, that one screen that one user will access once in a blue moon. Right? It's like a little bit of a CRUD thing that changes a setting and nobody cares. Why write tests for that? Now, if you have this other thing that decision makers that are using your application are using every day, and if that thing does not show or does not behave the way the guy needs, that by all means, go out of your way to find ways to do automated tests on that thing. Make sense? All right, anything else before we wrap up? That's it? All right, I'll be around for another couple of minutes. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jay, for the invite.
Thank you for speaking.
You bet. Always a pleasure.
I was thinking about the old testing.
Thank you for joining us for the October 2018 meeting of the Houston.net Users Group. Our next meeting will be on November 8th at the Improving Houston office at 10111 Richmond Avenue. Be there at 6:30 as we kick things off with pizza and prizes. If you happen to be in Houston then, or on any second Thursday, we'd love for you to join us.